bit of behavior intervention or RTI behavior. And so they're going to give you kind of an update in terms of what we've been doing, why we've been doing it, and where we're at with our progress. So I'm going to turn it over to them. We appreciate you being here, and I know this is going to be informative.
All right. Well, since Dr. Wagner has already done the introductions, I'll just go ahead and have us start on what our goal is. Steve and I hope today to be able to give you all a clearer understanding of what either PBIS, which stands for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, or PBI or PBS, which is just Positive Behavior Supports. The acronyms are used very interchangeably. The interventions that go along with them, where we are in Creighton School District, and where we are going next. The first thing that needs to happen before you can even start to implement something like PBIS in your schools is that there has to be a shift in the perspective about behavior and a shift in thinking. Behavior is not just something that we consequence, it's something that has to be taught. And so we also use the emphasis of implementing the RTI, response to intervention, for the behavior side as well, in order to support those students that are in all the different tiers of RTI. So the assumptions that you need to have, or the beliefs that we need to have in order to positively affect change in students' behavior is that behavior is learned, it is teachable, the occurrences of behavior are affected by the environment the students are in, and that the behavior is changeable.
And then next we wanted to spend some time just kind of talking about the logic about why we're choosing positive behavior supports in the school. So students come to school with multiple ideas of what correct behavior is. So depending upon my experiences as a student, I may think what I'm doing at school is okay based on it's allowed in my community or my home or my neighborhood. And that we know that if everybody understands what the behavior expectations are, we have a better chance of students having success towards their academics. So we kind of relate it to sports rules. When you play basketball, you have certain rules for basketball. When you play football, you have certain rules for football. You need to understand that those rules will change depending upon what you play. So we want our kids to understand that even though those may be rules or behaviors that are okay in your home or your community, when you come to school, these are the expectations that we expect for everyone. So this is just some kind of what the research shows about positive behavior support. And so we basically know that behavior disruptions can interrupt learning in a classroom if the teacher has to spend a lot of time redirecting students or making sure students are doing that behavior. That takes time away from the academic learning and supports that they need for that. And that also the disruptive behavior can lead to even more aggressive types behavior if that student is allowed to continue to behave that way in the classroom. Okay, and then the research is also showing that the exclusion and punishment that usually happens in school is not effective at producing long-term behavior. So I know in my time as an assistant principal, I have yet to see a student that left on a suspension and come back as a changed student without any kind of supports being put in there for them to change that behavior. So again, the big focus is if we can teach students how to behave, just like we teach academics. So if I'm a teacher in the classroom and my student's struggling with reading or math, I'm not going to send them out to the office or send them home for a few days. I'm going to teach them how to become better at math and reading. The same philosophy holds true for behavior. So we can teach a student how to behave and why that's important.
And if I could add something, one of the challenges with moving in this direction is that many of us came from backgrounds where you did something wrong, the consequence was immediate. And what we know from both experience and a research base is that that initial kind of negative consequence works as long as the person delivering the consequence is there. But it doesn't change long-term behavior. It may change the behavior right now because I'm mad and I want you and you're going to go do this. But it doesn't change long-term behavior. And so when Steve is talking about teaching the new behaviors, the replacement behaviors, the research is there to show that that actually changes behavior long-term within that environment. And I think that's an important thing to understand, because when a child's acting up in class and they're preventing you from teaching, the first thing you want to do is get them out of there, right? You want to get so you can continue to do your job. That doesn't change the behavior. That just gets them out of the class. And may, in fact, for some kids, reinforce the behavior if they're having challenges with their learning, right?
Or especially for like our families that work, both mother and father, sometimes multiple jobs. If we're sending a student home on a suspension, oftentimes they're left without any supervision whatsoever at the home. So we're going to get a little bit into that more too, about the proactive part of PBIS, where you're when everything is in place, we will be able to target those students that are possibly moving down that path, and then put those steps in place to correct that behavior before they reach that level where they need to be suspended because the offense is
psychologically,
serious.
that's a critical distinction in terms of changing the adults in the system, right? Moving the adults from short-term consequence thinking to long-term behavior change thinking. And whether that adult is the assistant principal or whether that is a classroom aide or a teacher, that's an important distinction to make within this type of process.
It's really a paradigm shift in how normally we think about behavior, because like Jim said, we're trying to look at behavior in terms of how can I help the student change their behavior, as opposed to having steps to get them sent out. The steps should be something, how is the step going to help me have the student re-enter the classroom and become a learner in my classroom, as opposed to being a step to move up the line. Did I have one more slide? Did I beat? Jim stole my thunder.
I didn't mean to. I just
It's just another slide that basically is saying that we know that if we're just having exclusionary punishment for students without any kind of behavior modification and training, that's not as successful.
So what research is finding that our most effective responses to school violence or to school misbehavior is the social skills training, the academic restructuring, that's giving those interventions for academic frustrations for students, so that if they're struggling academically, they're not acting out with their behaviors, which then causes behavior problems. And then putting those behavioral interventions, not just punishing and consequencing, but doing interventions to help students learn how to behave. So what is school-wide positive behavior support? PBIS, PBS. The first thing that's important to understand is it's not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's a system that you put into place. And because it's a system, it can be designed to fit the needs of each school. So while we're implementing PBIS throughout all of the 9 schools at Creighton, it's going to look very different at Gateway than it looks at Loma Linda. Pieces might look the same, pieces might be different, because my students are different than Steve's students, and my community is a little bit different than Steve's community. So that's why it's very important that it's a system, not just a curriculum that we're purchasing and teaching our students. The biggest features of PBIS is that we're really focusing on prevention. We're defining and teaching those positive social expectations. We're acknowledging that positive behavior and really reinforcing positively for those students that there are consequences, but they're very consistent, and that they're instructionally based, not punitively based. That we're using data to make those decision makings, and then for those students that need individual interventions, there's a continuum of interventions that are available for those students, and that it's team-based implementation. It isn't one person doing it, it takes everyone implementing the program. So hopefully this slide is something that looks very familiar to you. This is the response to intervention pyramid, and you can see that PBIS is on the right-hand side, the behavioral systems. That's what PBIS is based on. It's response to intervention, but for behavior. And so the school-wide systems that we're about to talk about are really focusing on that bottom tier, the tier 1. These are systems that all students are receiving to help them learn how to behave at school. And for 85 to 90 or 80 to 85% of our students, it should be working. That should be enough support for them. It's just for those upper small percentage of students that need that extra support. So here are the school-wide positive behavior interventions and support. There are 8 key features. And we're going to go through each of these features and also follow up with where are we with those features in Creighton School District. So you can see the list of them there, but it's administrative leadership and support. It's team-based. Behavioral expectations are both defined and taught and then reinforced. Behaviors are then monitored and corrected, and data is used to drive our decisions about what to do with behaviors and what to do at our schools to make behavior more conducive to the learning environment. And including family and community collaboration is very important when we're implementing PBIS.
Okay. And then one of the main features also about the response to intervention and the PBIS is that it's always being assessed. How are we doing? What are we doing? So as we go through the 8 key features today, we're going to kind of say where we felt as a district we fall in full implementation, partial implementation, or not yet started. Okay, the first one is administrative leadership and support. So are the school leaders actively adopting, implementing, and maintaining the school-wide behavior support? And is that discussed at faculty meetings and throughout really our day-to-day operations at the school? And in Creighton District, we felt that we were in full implementation. All schools have support from administration. There's teams involved, and it's talked about when we meet with parents, when we meet as staff members. Of course, always looking towards even more improvement in those areas and making sure it's always part that we're always talking about.
This is kind of a question for you. The schools, since this is part of the duties of a vice principal, what about the schools that don't have vice principals? Who does it fall upon?
In most, first of all, in all cases, it all falls upon the principal. But particularly in the 2 schools, one of the schools has the behavioral interventionist that works very closely with the principal, and at Biltmore Prep, it's between the primarily it's handled with the principal.
And that's also another part of PBIS that brings up is so the idea that the assistant principal is, or there's one person on campus that handles the discipline and the problems, is not really behind PBIS. That it's really a school, everyone's on board of what happens. So, great question. Okay, and so for that you have a team established. The team has representation of all stakeholders, meaning that you have administration, you have teachers, you have support staff, you have non-certified staff, parents and students involved, and that the team meets regularly in a formal meeting where there's an agenda, minutes are taken, and then that whatever is decided at that meeting is going out to the campus. And at Creighton, we felt that we were in partial plus we gave us in the implementation. Every school has a team involved. Every team has the principal, teachers, and a non-certified staff, but we felt that we needed to this year move towards including more community members and parents as well as students into that team decision making.
Excuse me, I don't know if you're going to go into this later, but can you talk a little bit about the role of students
in the team?
in the team?
Well, we will talk about it a little bit later, but we're going to be at the schools where we're going to be creating matrices for each of the rules of the school, which is like if it's be responsible, be respectful, be positive, that what does that look like specifically when I'm in the cafeteria, and in that, then that will be rolled out to students and parents to get their feedback on what they think about that too. So ultimately the goal of positive behavior supports is that you have a school where the students are really running the behavior, so when new students do come in and they misbehave, that the message they get from the students on that campus is that's not how we behave here at Gateway, or that's not how we behave at Loma Linda, so that it's the community that's really driving that behavior. So at least at Gateway, I don't think we're at the level yet where the students are running that, but that's where we're looking towards in the future, that they would be responsible for that.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, I think at Loma Linda, trying to get the feedback from students, because a big part of this is that recognition of positive behavior. And if you're recognizing students with a certain reward or award and it's not meaningful to them, then it's really not going to be effective. So getting that student feedback is one way we've done it at Loma Linda. Is what kind of prizes do you want to see? What kind of recognition do you want to get from your teacher, from the school, for your positive behavior. So that's definitely an area that we're still working out, is how do we get parents involved and what would their role be, and the student role as well. So the third feature is that behavioral expectations are defined, and Steve kind of just alluded to this, but every site has developed, or in PBIS you would develop 3 to 6 stated expectations that are positive, concrete, and something that can be easily remembered. And then they are kind of fleshed out to what does that look like then in the different areas around our campus. So for example, at Loma Linda, our 3 overarching rules are be safe, be respectful, be responsible. So that's quick and easy, it's our 3 Bs. But then when we talk about what does that look like in the cafeteria, what does being safe on the playground look like, what does being safe in the library look like, how are we respectful in assemblies, and so then creating a matrix, which here's an example, this is not obviously from any of our schools, but kind of you can see the rules going down the left-hand side of being safe, respectful, and being a learner, and then what does that look like in all those different settings. And some of our schools already have this really fleshed out and in a matrix form, and other schools are, one of our goals this year is going to be get those matrices in place at all sites, and that's where parents and students and teachers can have some input into, well, what do we want our students, or how do we want our students to be acting in the cafeteria in regards to being safe, or being respectful, or being responsible.
Can you go back to the matrix for a second?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I don't know that so under be respectful it says use polite language. People may have different ideas about what that is. I think if there's specific examples or models for what that looks like, how's that piece come into play?
That's going to go into the next feature, is that the
Okay.
behavior expectations then are taught. So then as a teacher, you might say use polite language, and then what is polite language, and talking about what is, what isn't, giving some examples and non-examples, and really kids can role play it. They can look at different scenarios and decide this is being safe, or this is being respectful, and this isn't.
Okay.
And that way everyone has the same understanding, and that's why it's important that all teachers kind of have the same understanding and are teaching it in similar ways, so that all the students have the same understanding of, at Loma Linda, what does it mean to use appropriate language at school.
It goes back to that teaching piece, so when a student does misbehave, it's not, we don't do that here, but it's like, that's not really polite language. Usually you say, may I please have, so you're teaching that student, and then you're modeling and giving them a chance to model it too.
So the matrix is a guide for teachers, not...
It's for students too, though, because it lists how it should be. So the idea behind that is that you have those matrices up. So when a student is misbehaving in the cafeteria, then I can take that student and show them, remember, here's how we behave, and this is the part that you're not really hitting right now. So let me show you some ways that you can speak positively, or talk to someone when you're angry and be respectful even though you are upset or angry.
The detail comes in the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
These are the reminders.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And just another thought, the matrix really just makes it more specific. We can say be safe, and that should be enough, except what does safe look like?
Right.
And so then you have to get more specific with what does it look like in different situations. But then teaching it even more from that. So the next part then is the features of positive school behavior expectations. They're positively stated, as I already said. They're visible to students, so they're posted in the hallways, in the classrooms, they're in their handbook, they're something that students are seeing a lot. They're taught directly to all students, and they're taught and reviewed at least 10 to 20 times a year. So that's a key piece, is that you don't just teach it once. You don't just do it at the beginning of the year and never touch it again. It's done throughout the year, and the whole school is involved in that.
Is this reinforced with parents then as well?
And that's the piece I know at Loma Linda we haven't really done a whole lot. If you ask one of my parents what are the rules at your school, I don't know that they can tell you. And so that's a piece that I know I need to start focusing on, is getting those newsletters out, getting information out to parents, using our parent liaison to help with that, so that when parents come on, they can help their students. They'll remember to be safe, respectful, responsible.
And that with the matrices being given out to parents too, so that they can see what it is and offer feedback to it. So I'd say we barely scratched the surface there, but that's a huge piece that we're going to focus on in this upcoming year.
Okay.
And on that 10 to 20 times a year, it's, after breaks, or whenever you start to see the kids slipping on those behaviors, you come back and you reinforcement. Where this really gets to be important and a little bit more challenging is when our kids are in middle school and they grow up and they look big, and the common thinking is they look more like adults, they should know better, right? And what we've learned over years and years is they don't know better, and so they have to be taught. And so even though initially it seemed a little bit awkward, we're still dealing with children who do not have full frontal lobe development, and they need to have instruction in these areas. So it's a little bit more challenging for both the teachers and the students in the middle school level.
And that kind of goes back to the very beginning of the presentation when there's those behavior assumptions. You can't assume that students know how to act, that they've been taught how to act at home. We have to teach it in the school. And then just a personal example, my daughter is 11 and awkward is the only word I can use to describe her right now. She can only follow one-step directions at this point, and you know, so she's definitely in that middle school mentality of, yes, she's older and I know she used to know these things, but I have to do a lot more reinforcement and a lot more clear, explicit instruction with her than I used to, and so I can't wait till she's outgrown those awkward years. Yeah. I think she had it developed and then it went away for a while.
She'll be borrowing your frontal lobe.
So, you know, and again, we have partial implementation, depending on which piece you're looking at. I think we all have, our rules and procedures have been pretty much defined as far as our big, be safe, be respectful, be responsible, and that's a pretty common one throughout all 9 schools. There's definitely the idea of them being taught, but one of the things that is our first goal as APs is to make sure all of us have those matrices done early in September, so that that piece is done so we can move on with the more of the implementation and the teaching. And these two really go very hand in hand. So not only do you have them define the behavioral expectations, but you have to teach them. We've already been talking about that a little bit. So again, that assumption that you have to teach expectations, so you have to have a plan then for how you're going to teach it. Teachers need to have a plan for what are we teaching, how are we teaching it, so it looks the same from one classroom to the next. That they're teaching it in that area. I'm not going to teach hallway expectations in my classroom. I'm going to take my kids out to the hallway and I'm going to teach them these hallway expectations in the hallway. It can be taught through assemblies, through videos. I know Monte Vista, Angela Gross has developed a video that teaches her kids playground expectations, and it's on SharePoint, and teachers can use that to show this is safe expectations on the playground. Kids can do role plays and skits. There's lots of different ways it can be taught. And then the idea of it's being reviewed and retaught at least quarterly. 10 to 20 years is way more than quarterly. But at Loma Linda, after every break, school-wide, we have a schedule and every teacher is expected to be at a certain location, practicing with their students and teaching those. But then teachers are individually going to do that in their classrooms often throughout the school year when they see that things are happening that shouldn't be happening in their classroom. No, that's not about. So you're teaching social behavior just like academic skills. Our focus is really on making sure that the teachers know, especially with as many new teachers as we have this year on most of the sites. They need to understand that behavior needs to be taught, and they need to understand how to teach and what to teach those skills to students. And it isn't just procedures and routines, but it's also social skills, like how to greet others, how to make eye contact, how to follow directions. What does following directions mean? So in the Creighton School District, we believe that we're definitely in partial implementation. Pieces of it are definitely there. I think this will probably be an ongoing partial implementation because it will always be being refined, and as we bring new teachers in, getting them on board, letting them learn the expectations and how to teach. So I think that's it for me.
And then the next part is acknowledging and reinforcing that appropriate behavior. So is there a system for acknowledgement that's developed at the schools in 4-to-1 ratio of acknowledge for all students, which means for every time a student is redirected for something they're not doing, they should receive at least 4 times that they're getting complimented for that good behavior. And interestingly enough, on Sunday morning a couple of weeks ago, they had a thing on relationships that were successful, and that was one of the things of a successful relationship with your significant other is that 4-to-1 positive things you're talking about as opposed to the 1 negative thing. And the thought behind this is that if a behavior is important enough that we expect you to teach it and know it, then it should be important enough that we're rewarding that when you're doing that positive behavior. And speaking for myself, I read an article saying to really look as you're walking through your school and in your classrooms about all those positive things that are happening, but not just noticing them, but actually verbalizing that you notice them, because we tend to just look and correct the things that are going wrong as opposed to pointing out all those things. So I think if you can build that culture where you're really looking and highlighting those positive behaviors, that's a big step towards getting the students to start using those behaviors. Some of the things we use at our schools are, like this is an example from Lori's school, Loma Linda. They have a B ticket for their 3 Bs of be responsible, be respectful, be safe. And then, oh, it's up there. Okay, and so teachers can write the student's name and give it to the teacher. That student has something they can take home or put up in the classroom. And then they also go into a raffle. So once a week, names are pulled from that raffle where kids can come up and get prizes from the principal at the school. And that's something that's pretty similar to all schools. We don't obviously all use the B ticket, but like a Gateway, we use Geckos that kids get. So rewarding that positive behavior when you see it. And then intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. Obviously, we want to move towards the latter, but in the beginning, just to make sure the kids are getting those little awards and behaviors for doing the good thing, and especially for low socioeconomic families, they tend to value that short-term reward over the long-term reward. So making sure that you're really using those short terms to build to that student who's going to want to do it because it's the right thing and the best thing to do. And at Creighton School District, we thought we were in, again, partial implementation, that we do have those things going for the B ticket, but to really change the behavior thinking of all of the staff and community towards really highlighting those positive things as focusing on the negatives that we need to change. Then the 6th is monitoring and correcting behavioral errors.
So everything we put into place so far is hopefully going to keep students from making errors or as many errors, but we know that they're going to. So we need to constantly be monitoring their behavior and then correcting those behavior errors when they occur. In order to do this, problem behaviors need to be clearly defined. There needs to be a referral system. Responses to behaviors need to be developed, and they need to be instructionally based versus being punitive or solely punitive. Staff consensus is definitely something that needs to happen. Everyone needs to be on the same page. And so in Creighton School District, I think we're in somewhere between not in place to partial implementation. Some of the things that we have done, I think that would be definitely in place, is that APs have really spent a lot of time deciding, and this has been over every year since I've been here, what are office managed behaviors versus teacher managed behaviors. So it's very much defined for our staff. If this behavior happens, this is a teacher managed behavior. You manage this in your classroom through your own positive reward system and or consequence system. And then there are those office managed behaviors that these are things you would refer to the office. So that's something that's definitely in place at all sites. The trick comes, and there's lots of gray areas in terms of behavior. So one teacher might see 2 students, for example, one teacher managed behavior is pushing, shoving. One teacher sees 2 students pushing and shoving in line. Somebody shortcut and now they're pushing and shoving each other. One teacher would see that as teacher managed, which it should be, and would handle it within their own management system. Another teacher would see pushing and shoving and consider that, well, that was fighting, and so it's an office referral, or that was an assault because he pushed the other student, so therefore it's an assault. So there's lots of gray areas depending on severity, depending on teacher perception, depending on the students involved. I think we tend to, if we see 2 students pushing and shoving who normally don't behave like that, it's considered a little lower level behavior versus 2 students who are always pushing and shoving, it's higher. So those kinds of things still need to be really better defined and getting more teachers on the same track with what they see as teacher managed versus office managed behavior. Our referral system is definitely in place in the Creighton School District. However, we are implementing Infinite Campus. We started with it last year, and every site's in a different phase of implementation, although this year all teachers are expected to be inputting their classroom managed or teacher managed behaviors into that system, and then using it also to make referrals to the office. We have lots of new staff, as has already been mentioned, and so they're going to have to be brought up to speed on all of it. What is teacher managed? What is office managed? How do I use the referral system? How do I do the inputting and documenting? And then there's how do we respond to behaviors? Because traditionally, teachers have been taught the consequence, and I did a training with our new teachers, and we talked about the 4 components of classroom management, and consequences is really only 10% of what you do as a teacher to manage your classroom. And that should be how it is for a school too. Consequences should be a very minimal amount of what we do to manage behavior at our school. It's all about behavior, expectations, setting them and teaching them, having that good rapport with students, and then monitoring and responding. And so one of the things that's not in place yet is having all teachers respond in the same way to behavior, because there's a big variety, as I've already suggested, into how 2 teachers might respond to the same behavior error that happens. So it's important that we have some consistency, we have some continuums of responses for our teachers so that they know how they can respond, and that their responses are more instructional and teaching a replacement behavior versus just punitive. And there's definitely a place for consequences. They should be logical and natural, but a consequence, I think, as we already had talked about, doesn't change that behavior. It might stop it in the moment, but what do I do instead of? If I'm getting in trouble and I'm getting a detention or I'm getting some sort of consequence, you're calling my mom because I'm pushing someone because they made me angry, but you didn't teach me what to do the next time someone makes me angry, then it's not going to change my behavior, and I'm probably going to push again.
And the best examples of consequences not changing behavior is recidivism rates, whether that be in school or prison, right? If consequence worked, people wouldn't go back to prison, kids wouldn't do the behavior again.
Mm-hmm.
And we have plenty of evidence to show that they do, unless you do something, you intervene in another way.
And so it's really about the whole system is learning and teaching our teachers what can you do to teach a replacement behavior for that child who's acting that way. Yes, you might have to give them a consequence so they know that that's not an okay behavior in your classroom, but then what do you do to teach them to act a different way?
You had mentioned earlier about the redundancy with the children going over the rules again and again, 10 to 20, I think your numbers were, 10
Yes.
to 20 times a year. When the board gets the paperwork for an expulsion of a child, it starts off, it's kind of standard wordage. The child and mother signed, received the school handbook, and they signed that they understood it. So what does either of your schools, I know you can't answer for the other schools, do either of your schools do anything to ensure that the parents and students understand the handbook and the consequence for this would be expulsion or this would be expulsion, that we're not going to, it's such a higher level that this is totally not acceptable at our schools, and it will, like bringing a weapon to school, whether it be a knife or an air pistol or having drugs. I mean, those are what I consider somewhat dangerous things in our schools, and would consequence would be expulsion for this.
And I'd have to say the answer, just speaking for myself and Melinda, is yes and no. We definitely, especially with the older students, I make sure that I take time to go over in an assembly at the beginning of the year, talk about what our expectations are, but then also talk with them about there are certain things that you can do at school if you make the choice to do it, that there are very severe consequences that are basically still kind of policy. Like, I've had several incidents of 4th graders, and so I always include 4th graders in this discussion now, where I started off just doing middle school. They bring pocket knives or dangerous objects to school, and it's the first time they've gotten in trouble, and I'm sitting there with the parent guardian responsibility form in front of me that the parent has signed off on that states, if you bring this device to school, it's a long-term suspension. And so there's always those surprise cases where the kid's going, I didn't know, I mean, they know it was wrong. They had a different motivation for bringing it, but I didn't know I was going to get in that much trouble. So in those cases, the parent had the form, the parent signed the form. Do they always know? Not always. But then there's also those individuals that have had ongoing behavior problems, and there's lots of conversations about where their continued behavior is going to lead, both with the student and with the parent.
Well, I was talking to Dr. Spiller earlier, and we were talking about Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts.
Mm-hmm.
I always had a pocket knife. The Girl Scouts have their emblem on a pocket knife.
Dangerous.
I never thought about it bringing it to school. I had, but that was eons ago before you had problems. Yes, now it would be dangerous to bring a Girl Scout knife to school. But it's a different culture summer, but then you got to get into winter. You go to camp, you have knives.
Right.
A kind of redundant question. We do have these student handbook and the rules and all this other stuff that they sign. It's in both languages, Spanish and English, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do the parents ever come to you and say, we didn't really understand what we signed, we're sorry our kid did this, can we work with y'all?
I've had parents say that. I don't think they've said that we didn't understand it, but I've had parents say, but my kid's a good kid, so they shouldn't get a long-term suspension, even though they brought alcohol to school.
But they've never disputed
because
their
they've never done it
responsibility for signing that form, where it clearly explained.
Because I have a copy of it, and I just pull it out, and it's right there. You signed it, and this was information that was presented to you.
But you
Whether
also
they read it or not, I don't know.
look at the incident by case happening. So if I have a second grader that brought a pocket knife to school because their dad gave them a pocket knife, or that it was their dad's and they were excited about it, but they're not using it to try and stab people or cut people or do anything like that. At least for myself, I look at that as that might not even be a long-term suspension for me, as opposed to bringing the paper in and talking to the parents about the expectations, and then having the parents sign out that they understand if their child does bring another weapon to school, then they will be long-term suspended. So it just, a lot of common sense, I think, falls into that about what happens. And again, it's educating families and students about what is expected behavior at the school.
And there's those gray areas again, because you're looking at so many variables. Again, you're looking at the age, whether the student's a troublemaker and has been doing these types of activities, and this is just one of several. What they did with it, like Steve said, I just brought it for show and tell, is a lot different than I pulled a kid into the restroom and threatened him with it. So there's lots of different variables as to whether we're going to decide to go full-fledged with what we're able to do as a consequence or do something different. But it doesn't change the behavior. All right, so now we're on data-based decision-making, which is our 7th key feature of positive behavior intervention supports. Data is very important, that we're using it to analyze, and we're analyzing it and we're using it to guide our decision-making about what we need to do in our school to be proactive and to prevent behaviors from happening at our school. So some of the things that we look at are office discipline referral data, suspension data. That data then needs to be shared with the team, and the team needs to use it to guide decisions, and also shared with the staff. We put not yet started, and it doesn't mean that there isn't data. I think part of the problem is that it's Infinite Campus, and we've been inputting discipline data into, since I've been here, this is my 5th year, I've inputted into now 3 different monitoring systems, and if I had to go back and pull a behavior report on a kid from 5 years ago, I'd have to pull from 3 different systems to get information on that child. So part of it is just getting a new system in place to collect that data, and then just making sure that we have the time and we take the time to look at that data. But we have the capability now to decide there's this many referrals happening and this many behavior problems happening in the cafeteria. That shows us there's a problem in the cafeteria. We need to look at what's going on in there. Do we need more supervision? Do we need to change some transition procedures? What do we need to do to cut down on these behaviors? So it's not that there isn't data, it's just that we now need to make sure we're consistent in how we're inputting it, how we're collecting it, and then take that time to make sure we're reviewing it and using it.
Yeah. So, not to say that this is a problem in Creighton. My sister called me because she had a challenge with her daughter, my niece. And it turns out that the teacher didn't like the discipline system they had, and the administration, she felt, wasn't supportive. I don't really know the circumstances, but what happened was, like, every day for like a month, or like every other day, my niece was at the nurse's office. Like, that was used as like the timeout discipline area. Is that something, like, how would you know to look for some data like that to know that there's a problem with like a student and a teacher, or like a circumstance, if it's not like discipline, it's not labeled as discipline, it's labeled as I have a stomach ache, and who knows if it's the teacher initiating it or my niece initiating it. Like, how would we know to look for that type of data here in Creighton?
That would probably, I mean, that wouldn't show up in our behavioral data, but hopefully, then, like at Gateway, the nurse tracks students that come up there. So we have a new nurse this year, but our nurse last year was very good at saying, there's this student from this classroom who's been up here for stomach aches or little problems for the last 7 days, and then I talked to the student and the mother, and it was kind of a issue of being afraid to come to school or not being happy about being at school. But
so we rely on the nurse to flag that for us.
yeah, because I wouldn't know personally if
Yeah.
unless I was in the nurse's office a lot and happened to see that student there.
Mhm.
But and also I've had parents that would alert me to this. My child doesn't want to come to school in the morning, or they bring them in the morning to talk about what's going on at school. And a lot of times it's not necessarily what's happening at school, but that they just they want to stay home and play video games or do something like that. But it is sometimes you have conflicts between teachers, or a teacher says something and the student takes it in a different way than the teacher means it to be presented. So,
Yeah.
but I would say at least at Gateway I would rely on the parents or the nurse for that information.
And see, the way I heard your question was kind of how do we make sure that teachers are following the discipline
Well, that, I mean, that
program?
too. I just
Because it doesn't sound like that teacher
is
was.
the system working?
Yeah.
Period. And if we're not tracking all the right data, but yeah, I mean.
And so I think that kind of goes back to, again, training your teachers and the expectation, because I know there's always those, I'll handle all the behavior. You're never going to get a referral from me, I'll handle it all. Well, there's certain behaviors that should be referred to the office because I should know about it. And teachers should be inputting what they do, or documenting somehow what happens in their classroom. So when a student shows up in my office with a referral, I have some way of knowing, is this the first time this problem has happened with this child, or is there a pattern? And so it's, again, educating our teachers about the importance of documenting behavior, being consistent with their behavior management system. But things like that, like if there is, I can think of a few examples of, we have had teachers in the past that would have those students, as I think Jim mentioned earlier, you just want them out of your classroom because they're driving you crazy, and the kid would go to a timeout room and be there all day. Well, that's not acceptable. And so some of those things probably happen for a while before someone kind of goes, you know, this kid's always being sent to my room for an hour every day and there's something wrong. And then I can have that conversation with the teacher or the student and find out what's going on. It's not a perfect system.
Yeah.
And we're definitely not even near perfection yet because we're still trying to implement it all. Okay, so the last and eighth feature of PBIS is that family and community collaboration, which definitely is important, that we're including parent and community members as part of our team, and that we're keeping our parents informed about what the expectations are at our school and what do we have in place, what systems do we have in place, because then those parents are going to know and not be surprised when something happens with their student and they're getting some sort of consequence that they didn't know about. Also that they can have input if they see things or they come up with ideas that they think would be better, or they have questions or concerns, and that they can help reinforce the school expectations with their children when they're at home. And I would say that where we're at in Creighton School District, which probably is kind of obvious after all the things we've talked about so far, is it hasn't really started yet. And it might be better in some sites than others, but the focus has really been, as we're bringing this into our school, getting our administration on board, getting our teachers on board, getting our students involved in it, and now obviously the next step is to make sure we're including our parents in that process.
And then the next section is the assessment tool for, like we did for the 8 steps, but in the individual sites, how are you doing in terms of positive behavior intervention and supports? And there's 2 main things that you can use, the team implementation checklist and the school-wide evaluation tool. And this year the APs kind of got together and looked at them and combined them into one checklist, which I think you have in your packet. It lists 14 of the things that staff and family and students will rate our sites at, so we can use that information to kind of hone in specifically at our sites for what areas we should be focusing on for the coming school year.
What does it say at the top of it?
Creighton School District, RPI, and PBIS, with for 2012-13.
Okay.
Grace or something.
Got it. Yeah, it's just passed, the first time we passed the blue.
And then, like I said, that we would be using that to assess how we're doing on our site.
Okay, so we're back to the triangle again. Everything that we've talked about so far has mostly been that tier 1. We're putting all these systems in place, teaching them to all students, reinforcing all students, and hoping to prevent any inappropriate behaviors or behavior errors at school. However, we know that not all students can get the same support and be successful. Some students need more support. And so about 10 to 15% of our students are going to fall into those tier 2 or tier 3 areas where they need more support than we're giving them just through the school-wide PBIS. So part of PBIS is also to offer tiered interventions. Some of the features of having targeted interventions for students is that these interventions need to be available and available rather quickly, because the student who's struggling with behavior can't wait forever to get help. Just as a student struggling with math shouldn't wait forever to get help or intervention to help them be successful. They need to be interventions that are low effort. If you try to do something that's got all kinds of bells and whistles, no one's ever going to be able to manage it, and it's not going to be helpful for anyone. They obviously need to be consistent with our school-wide expectations, being implemented by several people in the school and supported by all people in the school. There definitely needs to be parent involvement and student buy-in. If a student's not bought in to doing their plan or working on that goal, then you're kind of wasting your time. So you have to get the students to buy into it. And again, monitoring continuously to know if the plan's working and using those data to drive your decisions and change your intervention if necessary. So tier 2 interventions are for the students who are at risk for a social or behavioral concern. It might be a student who's continuously in some low-level problem behaviors. They're not big behaviors, but they're happening very frequently. Or it might just be a student who just needs that extra attention, and it helps them to focus and do a better job when they are getting that little bit more adult intervention. It's not for students, tier 2 interventions, that have serious or violent infractions, extreme chronic behavior, which would be considered 6 or more office referrals. It's not for students who need individualized support or students who require a full kind of wraparound, meaning there's lots of resources involved in helping them, or requiring a functional behavioral assessment or an FBA. Some examples, and this is an area that APs are just getting a little bit of information on. Tom Neary from WestEd came to our meeting last year and started to introduce us to some of the interventions we can start doing for tier 2, and so these are some that he shared with us. Newcomers Club, which is, as we get lots of new students throughout the year in our district, having a club that meets of all the new students once a month or maybe every other week, and taking that time to go over expectations and procedures and teaching them, because they might come in at a time when the class is fully functioning and the teacher isn't spending a lot of time on reviewing procedures and routines, and so they're not getting that same support that the other students in the class got. Social skills instruction, pulling small groups of students who are struggling. Maybe they're struggling with the skill of following directions, and so having them come together and doing some teaching and some practicing of that skill. Establishing a mentoring program, having teachers just identify, or staff members identify one kiddo that they're going to just check in with throughout the day. and just say, hey, how's your day going? What's going on? Not a full-fledged counseling, mentoring kind of thing, but just popping in and seeing how the child's doing in different parts of their day. Academic support, making sure that students are receiving the academic interventions they need so they're not acting out of frustration academically. Successful recess is a program where you either provide a little bit more supervision for certain students that are always having problems out on the recess yard, or maybe telling them, hey, if you're always getting in trouble when you're playing soccer, how about we go over and play on the playground equipment today and go down the slides and the swings, and giving them a different area and limiting their access to certain areas that they get into trouble in. And then the behavior education program is a check-in, check-out system that students have goals, and they know what their goals are, the parents know their goals, their teachers know their goals, and they check in with someone every morning, review what their goals are for the day, go throughout their day, and then they come back at the end and have someone they check in with at the end of the day to kind of say, how was your day, what are your plans for tomorrow, and then that paper goes home, and there's some parent being able to look over that and how their child did that day, and signing off on it as well.
Okay, and then the next part would be Tier 3 students, or that intensive student. And that's students that have a serious or violent infractions, extreme chronic behavior, and those are problems that would require a full behavioral assessment of that student. It's should be about 5 to 1% of our students. They're function-based, meaning that you do that functional behavior assessment, so you're honing in on one specific area that you want to improve on that child, and then there's specific steps that the student should be following, as well as the teachers and the staff. Proactive, so the theory behind this would be that we're getting those students that may be heading down that track and catching them before they do get suspended or expelled from school. And it has to have adequate time of instruction, practice, support, encouragement, and monitoring. Some of the things that you can use with those are specific individualized teaching skills for communication, tension reduction, choice making, social interaction, independent skills, and assertiveness training. And then we were going to talk about kind of what we thought the next steps were to look for at the Creighton School District in terms of our positive behavior support. So continuing that Tier 1 information of building those matrices at all of the schools, effectiveness of the PBIS team so that they're really being able to hone in on problem areas or problem students before they become full-on problems, including more staff, parent, community commitment, and then the RTI referral process, which there is a draft from the district in your packet also of kind of like how you referred for academic and the steps that would be going into the referral process for the behavior part of the RTI also. Tier 2 interventions, so we've learned a little bit about them, but now creating them throughout the district so that we have specific Tier 2 interventions when students are having problems and things that we can put them in and do for them to help them with that, and make sure that that's implemented at every site. So if it's working well at Monte Vista, it cannot be shared with all of the schools in the district. And then Tier 3 interventions is kind of where we feel like this year is going to be a research and discovery area for that. The issue with that is that Tier 3 interventions take a lot of time and staff commitment because it's one-on-one training for that student individually, and the time to do that functional behavior assessment so that we make sure that the Tier 3 intervention we're giving that child is the intervention that child needs and not an intervention that's not happening with the problem that's happening. So just kind of the discovery year for that. What are things out there? What are things that might be possible for us to implement here at Creighton School District? Okay, and then just open it up for any questions you might have.
No more questions? Thank you.
And then we also added just some websites you can go visit if you want to get some more information on. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys very, very much.
Thank you for spending your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Have a good afternoon. Yeah, thanks for.
Oh, we can go straight into